introduce you, and then you get up and take it. Then you can sit there.
Ja.
We're concerned that it's not getting full.
Ja, ist gut. Das, ja, sehr gut. Hey, yes,
Chantal Lynn,
yes,
very nice
yes,
meeting you.
yes.
I'm going to say hi.
Yes, hi.
Congratulations. You're going
Well,
to
let's
save
see.
me hours of reading because you're going to summarize.
Exactly. We'll even have a blog where it's all summarized. So.
Oh, cool. Okay, I'll
Yeah.
get it.
Yeah.
I just want to say
Thanks for coming.
Start from-
Okay.
Your microphone is on.
I think so. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first day of the WTO Public Forum, where we kickstart the program with the launch of the 2023 World Trade Report. I am Javier Gutierrez, and it is my privilege to lead the team that brings you this remarkable forum each year. Before we delve into the report's details, I would like to acknowledge and thank the report's coordinator, WTO Chief Economist Ralph Osa, and all of his team for their dedication to this project. Now, it is worth noting that the opening of the forum itself will take place at 4 p.m. right here in the WTO's Council Room. However, for now, we are here to explore the insights and findings of this year's report, which focuses on re-globalizing for a resilient, inclusive, and sustainable future. Our program today is divided in two parts. First, we will hear from Ralph Osa in a solo presentation where he will share the key highlights and takeaways from the report. Following that, we will have an interview with Bloomberg's Oliver Crook, who will further delve into the report's implications and insights. The 2023 World Trade Report is a valuable resource that offers guidance in navigating the complexities of global trade while promoting resilience, inclusivity, and sustainability. I am sure you will find it both thought-provoking and eye-opening. So without further ado, let's begin with Ralph Olsa's presentation, which will be followed by his discussion with Oliver Crook. Thank you for joining us on this first day of the WTO Public Forum as we explore the dynamics of re-globalizing for a better future. Ladies and gentlemen, I leave with you Ralph Olsa.
Well, thank you very much, Javier, and welcome everybody. I'm grateful that so many of you are here, and I'm extremely excited to present the 2023 edition of our flagship publication, the World Trade Report. So the World Trade Report this year asks a big question. What is the role of international trade in building a more secure, inclusive, and sustainable future? And this question is at the heart of a contentious policy debate, a contentious debate about the future of globalization, which has potentially profound implications also for the future of the WTO. While it is widely acknowledged that international trade brings about substantial efficiency gains, it is increasingly argued that some of these gains need to be sacrificed to pursue more important policy objectives. In particular, to maintain peace and security, to reduce poverty and inequality, and to achieve a sustainable economy. And this is a fundamental departure from the trade-affirming narrative that has guided trade policymaking since the foundation of our multilateral trading system in 1947. This narrative has gained traction amidst a series of crises and also important shifts in the international balance of economic power. Rising geopolitical tensions raise questions about the potential for a weaponization of trade policies. The COVID-19 pandemic has made clear how important it is to have resilient supply chains. The rise of China has put pressure on workers in some industrialized countries and has also made it difficult for some emerging economies to maintain strong export growth. And the rising and the ongoing climate crisis, or the rising awareness concerning the climate crisis, is raising questions and fueling doubts whether it's possible to combine or whether international trade is compatible with the decarbonization of the economy that we need. So the report starts off by showing that this change in narrative matters. While trade continues to thrive in many ways, trade tensions are rising, and first signs of fragmentation are emerging. So that's one of the main messages of the report. Trade continues to thrive in many ways, but trade tensions are rising, and first signs of fragmentation are emerging. Now, the rise of trade tensions we can observe, for example, in various WTO bodies. For example, the number of trade concerns raised in the Committee on Market Access quadrupled between 2015 and 2022. And the number of unresolved concerns that were then escalated to the more political Council for Trade in Goods even increased ninefold over the same time period. Perhaps the most striking finding of this part of the report is that trade is gradually becoming reoriented along geopolitical lines. To make this point, we looked at trade within and between hypothetical geopolitical blocs based on voting patterns in the United Nations General Assembly. Just a standard measure of foreign policy similarity that's used in the academic literature. And it turns out that trade flows between these hypothetical blocs has grown 4 to 6% more slowly than trade flows within these blocs since the onset of the war in Ukraine, indicating a shift towards friendshoring. At the same time, talk of deglobalization is still far from supported by the data. Bilateral trade between China and the United States was at a record high in 2022. Trade was remarkably resilient during the COVID-19 pandemic, bouncing back to pre-pandemic levels less than a year after the first wave of lockdowns. And trade in digitally delivered services remained strong all along, growing at an average annual rate of 8.1% between 2005 and 2022, outpacing goods trade and also services trade. After having established that this change in the narrative matters, that we see implications in terms of trade policy and also trade outcomes, the report then turns to its main question, reviewing the evidence on the role of trade in building a more secure, a more inclusive, and a more sustainable world. The main conclusion, and that's the second main message of the report, the main conclusion is that we need to embrace trade instead of rejecting it if we want to overcome the most pressing challenges of our time. We need to embrace trade instead of rejecting it if we want to overcome the most pressing challenges of our time. And in particular, the report makes the case for extending trade integration to more economies, people, and issues, which is a process that we call re-globalization. And I'll come back to that with a number of examples, but just keep it in your minds. When I say re-globalization, what I mean extending trade integration to more economies, to more people, and to more issues. And I'll have examples of that shortly. This part of the report begins with an analysis of the relationship between trade and security, understood broadly to include economic aspects such as access to critical goods and resilience to shocks. And the key conclusion is that a strong multilateral trading system is the best guarantor of economic security because it provides the options we need when supply shocks hit. A case in point is the response of trade to the COVID-19 pandemic. I've already mentioned that trade was highly resilient, was remarkably resilient in 2020, but it was also an important source of resilience that helped us get through the pandemic, that helped us get or deal with the pandemic. In particular, international supply chains became vital to ramping up the production and distribution of medical supplies, with trade in medical goods rising at a rate of 16% in 2020, trade in personal protective equipment rising by almost 50%, and trade in face masks rising by 80%. Another example are the supply chain disruptions associated with the war in Ukraine, where a major food security crisis could be avoided thanks to open trade. For example, Ethiopia imported 45% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine before the war, and then saw these imports plunge dramatically by 75% in the case of Russia, and by essentially 100%, 99.9% in the case of Ukraine. However, Ethiopia was able to respond to these import shortfalls by finding alternative sources of supply quickly and importing wheat from the United States, but also Argentina. And what's interesting is that it hadn't imported any wheat, at least not wheat in substantive quantities from Argentina before. So this really shows you the importance of an open and multilateral trading system, because you never know what the source of supply shocks is going to be, and you also never know who has the capacity to help you deal with them. At the same time, the report stresses the need for expanding economic integration to more economies. And that's my first example of re-globalization. Remember, re-globalization is about expanding economic integration to more economies, people, and issues. So now I'm going to talk about the first dimension. We estimate that the share of bottleneck products, which we define as products that have both few suppliers and large market shares, so potential bottleneck products, I should say, that share, the share of these products in total trade has doubled from, or more than doubled, from 9% to 19% between 2000 and 2021. The report then turns to the relationship between trade and inclusiveness. It shows that trade is a powerful tool to improve living standards, which helped lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. From 1981 to 2019, lower and middle income economies increased their share in global exports from 19 to 29% and reduced the share of their population subsisting on less than $2.15 per day from 55% to 10%. I mean, think of this. $2.15 is the international $2.15. That's the international poverty line defined by the World Bank. And the share of people from lower and middle income economies living below that poverty line has fallen from 55% to 10%, and that has been associated with an expansion of international trade. At the same time, the report also acknowledges that import competition contributed to the loss of manufacturing jobs in countries like the United States, but it emphasizes that trade openness can go hand in hand with economic inclusion, suggesting that complementary domestic policies are key. For example, some of the most open economies, including Germany, Latvia, and the Netherlands, are also some of the most equal ones, which again is highlighting this point. Highlighted here is the need for re-globalization, and this time I'll give you an example about expanding economic integration to more people. For instance, African women would gain disproportionately from a reduction in the trade barriers to digital trade, because 3 out of 4 African firms trading exclusively through e-commerce are owned by women. So that would be another example of re-globalization. And then finally, the report looks at the relationship between trade and sustainability. It acknowledges that this relationship is complex, but it also makes clear that there's substantial scope for trade to be part of the solution when it comes to climate change. For example, trade provides access to technologies which are vital for the green transition. The import of high-quality wind turbines is a case in point, as they allow wind-rich countries to scale up their renewable energy generation, even if they don't have access to the know-how to produce such turbines domestically. And this also provides a good example of the need to expand trade integration to more issues, which is the third dimension of re-globalization that I want to highlight. In particular, research shows that trade is a strong force multiplier for climate policies. Simulations show that more than 1/3 of the emissions reduction achieved by a hypothetical global carbon tax would be due to what we call environmental gains from trade. Just as there are economic gains from trade, which originate from countries specializing in what they're relatively good at, there are also environmental gains from trade originating from countries specializing in what they're relatively green at. But this requires open trade coupled with coordinated climate action, and in that sense, an expansion of trade integration to more issues. Of course, the report also discusses the role of the WTO in fostering re-globalization. It underlines that WTO members have already made progress towards this goal in recent years. Examples include multilateral agreements like the Trade Facilitation Agreement and the Fisheries Subsidy Agreement, as well as plurilateral outcomes on services, domestic regulation, and investment facilitation for development. To cite just one number, WTO estimates show that the Trade Facilitation Agreement has led to an increase in trade flows by $321 billion, of which most of the gains, or at least a substantial share, accrued to least developed countries. The exports of which increased by 2.4%, with a 17% increase in the agricultural sector. So in some sense, that's a policy change bringing about re-globalization. But to achieve a secure, inclusive, and sustainable future, clearly more needs to be done. The WTO Trade Cost Index shows that trade costs in middle and low-income countries are 27% higher than in high-income countries. Trade costs in services are 34% higher than in manufacturing, and trade costs in agriculture even 46% higher than in manufacturing. And this points to trade cost reductions for developing countries, in agriculture, and also in services, and particularly in digitally delivered services, as natural priorities for the future. Thank you very much, and now I'm looking forward to the discussion with Oliver.
Thank you very much, Ralph. This was very enjoyable and very informative. And now I would like to invite Oliver Crook from Bloomberg to join Ralph on the floor. Oliver, the microphone is yours now.
All righty. Hello, everyone. I hope this is working. Thank you so much for the presentation. Very edifying. So the title of the report, Re-globalization for a Secure and Inclusive Sustainable Future. The first question I have, before we talk about re-globalization, are we done deglobalizing?
I mean, let me put it like that. Now better? Okay, perfect. So are we done deglobalizing? I mean, first of all, I think, one of the main messages of the report is that, there's really no clear signs of deglobalization in the data. If you look at the trade to GDP ratio, for example, what you see is that it has stagnated, since the global financial crisis, but has remained, relatively stable then. So, perhaps we can talk about slowbalization, but I wouldn't talk about globalization. So for me, this report is really just saying, look, things are changing. We see a change in the narrative. The change in the narrative is beginning to have effects on trade policy, and these changes in trade policy are beginning to have effects on trade flows. So it's more, we're more saying globalization is at a crossroads, and we need to think about where we want to go.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the executives that we speak to, this is very front of mind, is to get sort of security friendshoring, or a lot of these terms that we hear a lot about. And you have an interesting sort of piece of research on this that puts a bit of the sort of numbers and demystifies a little bit of kind of what this deglobalization would look like, and if the world separates into different trading blocks. And you say that it basically will result in a 5% reduction in real income. I'd like to just sort of understand kind of how you get there, and kind of how is that 5% dispersed around the world?
Yeah, so it's true, that a fragmentation of the world economy into rivaling blocks would, of course, be, costly economically, and we've done some simulations that are trying to shed light on that. And, if you simulate the worst case scenario, which is really, a complete separation of the world economy into rivaling geopolitical blocks, as you said, we find that real income would fall by 5%, trade flows would fall by 13%, but clearly, what we also find is that, this is would hit developing countries particularly hard, because they're really dependent on the technology transfers that come along with trade. But let me add one thing. So, it's true that fragmentation would be costly economically, but in some sense, the whole point of this report is to say that it would also be costly in terms of other potentially more important policy objectives. In particular, we're not going to be able to achieve a sustainable economy. We're not going to be able to reduce poverty and inequality. And we're also not going to be able to build a sustainable, a secure, or maintain peace and security, I think, if we don't embrace international trade.
And at the sort of current rate of where we're going, and we look at the sort of three major trading blocks, being the United States, the European Union, and China, kind of where do you see that triangle heading with no other sort of, just in its current momentum? How do you see those relationships evolving now?
I mean, it's hard for me to make, concrete predictions on where things are going. But, clearly, as we document in the report, trade tensions are rising, and I think this is something that's concerning us. At the same time, our members, also continue to be actively engaged and productively engaged in discussions here at the WTO. So that's what I mean. In some sense, we are not predicting a gloom, but we're also not predicting, that everything is going to be fantastic. And really, we're just saying we're at a crossroads, and we really need to decide where we want to go.
And on that current trajectory, how much of that 5% do we get? Do you think, just given kind of where we're heading?
So we haven't done estimates.
I asked only because, I was just in the sort of Munich car show. I was interviewing a lot of the Chinese automakers, for example, who are now looking at expanding into the international market. They're all looking at Europe. None of them are touching the United States.
I mean, we don't have any, so we haven't conducted any estimates of kind of where we are, but we're certainly at the very beginning. The report reviews some literature on what the GDP losses associated with China-U.S. trade frictions are for the U.S. economy. I don't recall the numbers now off the top of my head, but they're relatively small at this point.
And in terms, we also saw sort of record complaints coming in last year, I think, or 2022, for all the data that we have. What is the sort of substance of those complaints? If we're trying to diagnose kind of why there's so much friction, what are people complaining about?
Well, the interesting thing that you see in the statistics is that we see an increase in complaints in the or not complaints, like trade concerns, we call them, in some of our committees, and in particular in committees that are not a natural home for complaints that are usually raised at the WTO. One way to read this is that some of the concerns that are rising are new concerns. For example, concerns related to the security exception, or concerns related to sustainability that don't kind of squarely fall into one of the domains of the specialized committees that we have.
And in what ways can we say that this impulse towards deglobalization, what parts of that do you think are legitimate, or just an airing of a legitimate concern, whether it's national security and the lessons that have kind of been learned from the pandemic?
I mean, I think the concerns themselves are very legitimate. Yeah. I think it is important to maintain peace and security. It is important to achieve a sustainable economy, and it is important to reduce poverty and inequality. I just think, the conclusion, or the way in which these concerns are addressed, at least that's what the report is trying to argue, are sometimes misguided, because we think more trade is really what we need, and not less trade. So in some sense, I think trade is, I think, often portrayed as part of the problem, but if done right, can be an important part of the solution.
And I want to touch a couple of the sort of risks to the outlook for sort of the things that you're talking about. As it may have not escaped your notice, there is a sort of the early stages of a U.S. presidential campaign underway, and with Trump sort of leading the Republican ticket, with sort of these campaigning on something that looks like 10% automatic tariffs on everything. Now, we probably don't have what that would actually mean in terms of economic figures, but what does it mean kind of more broadly for the kind of risk to global trade and also the consequences? I mean,
of course, we don't have a position on that proposal exactly, but what I can say is that really, I mean, maybe a useful thing I can say is that you have to distinguish a little bit between the trade costs that are put in place, the tariffs are put in place, or whatever policy instrument you have, and the consequence this has on trade flows, and just the perception that perhaps that the trade costs we currently have in place are at risk. So in some sense, what I think we observe is a rise in trade policy uncertainty, and this rise in uncertainty in itself is damaging to trade flows potentially, even if nothing happens.
And the WTO, and I think a lot of sort of international policy, has been founded on sort of this premise that greater economic integration lessens the risk of military political conflict, and that's sort of been a tenet that has guided this. We've seen two WTO members, Russia, Ukraine, that sort of that not really being the guiding principle there. Has that taught us something? Has there been a sea change in kind of how we view that?
I mean, in the chapter on trade and security, it's mostly on economic security, on supply chain resilience, but we do also review the literature on the link between trade and national security, following this, guiding principle that you have mentioned. And I mean, it turns out the relationship between trade and national security is complex, but on balance, I would say that the literature suggests that trade has a pacifying role. But personally, I think it's it makes more sense to really focus on the economic security angle. And you mentioned the war in Ukraine. I mean, of course, if you have a shock like this, if you have an incident like this, it's going to have consequences. It's going to have consequences. I mean, beyond the human tragedy, for trade flows also. But I think what we document in this report, drawing on earlier work, is that at least having open multilateral trade helped countries cope with this shock.
And as we sit here, there are currently some of the biggest sort of military drills going on off of the island of Taiwan. Have you modeled what a sort of change in status there, what kind of impact that would have? Is that the 5% world that we're talking about, or is that something bigger than that?
No, so we haven't looked at anything like that. Just to clarify, the 5% number that you mentioned that we discussed before, that's really just about tariff or trade policy tensions. Of course, if there was some sort of escalation of a geopolitical conflict, which we don't see and also don't hope for, of course, that would make the picture look very different. But then, presumably, we have other worries then also.
Indeed. So let's try to get away from the gloom a little bit and talk about the sort of re-globalization. Given sort of the issues that we've seen with globalization, or the complaints that we've seen, in some of the treatments that some of the governments have put forward to try to de-globalize, what do you think the principles are that should sort of guide the effort to re-globalize?
I mean, I think first and foremost, there needs to be an understanding that many of these issues that are on policymakers' mind are intrinsically related to international trade. So think about the environment, for example. Most people, when they think about trade and the environment, they think of trade, they think of transportation, they think of transportation costs and transport emissions. You think of planes and cars and buses and so on, and you cannot fathom that trade might be part of the solution to climate change. But then if you take a step back and realize that transport emissions are only a third of the emissions that are associated with traded products, 2/3 of the emissions are actually associated with the production of these products, and there's large variation in production emissions across countries. You begin to see that trade can actually be part of the solution if you source goods from relatively green origins. And it's this kind of understanding that we need, that this is an interconnected world where we need also this interconnection across issues. So one thing that I would hope for is that, for example, if environmental policymakers design environmental policies, that they don't just think about the environment narrowly, but also talk to their trade colleagues occasionally and kind of take these things into account.
And with that sort of model in mind, does the WTO need to evolve as an institution to try to navigate these things? What do you think the role of the institution is going forward, and how does it, do you think, need to change?
I mean, the WTO, of course, remains at the center of the rules-based trading system and will need to evolve also to deal with these challenges. I mean, as I was mentioning in my remarks at the very end, even some of the analysis we have in this report, points to some areas of progress. We know that developing countries are still facing high trade costs. We know that trade costs in agriculture are still high. We know that trade costs in services are still high, particularly digitally delivered services. It's kind of counterintuitive because you think, that should be free. But of course, then you start thinking about, all sorts of regulatory barriers, information barriers, e-signatures and, whatnot. So having further progress in these areas where there are great obstacles to international trade that also stand between us and the more integrated, more broadly integrated world economy, I think would be important. But that's just what comes out of the report. We of course have other things on our agenda too, as I'm sure you know.
And thinking about sort of decoupling and deglobalization, the sort of one of the great acts of deglobalization that occurred fairly recently and monopolized a large portion of my life when I was living in London was Brexit. And so I'm curious to know from you, kind of, was the outcome more or less what we expected? What was different? And are there lessons to draw from that for kind of what this impulse towards globalization could result in?
I mean, we have a short section. It's not a dedicated section, but Brexit, the literature on Brexit comes up also in the report. Not so much a comparison of what were the predictions and what were the outcomes, but maybe one thing to highlight that we already touched upon before. One interesting fact that we review here from another paper is that even when Brexit was voted for but nothing had happened, even that alone already meant that investment flows were changing, for example, which gets back to this trade policy uncertainty issue that I was highlighting before. In many ways, what we have to do at the WTO is not so different from what central banks have to do. They're all about managing inflation expectations. We are all about managing trade cost expectations. And I guess, the Brexit vote and the effect that just the vote had on investment flows and trade flows, I guess is a warning sign that we really need to make sure not just that trade costs remain low, but that also the trust in the multilateral trading system remains strong.
And you've taken us neatly to another topic, inflation. To what, because the sort of globalization has sort of had a net sort of deflationary effect on the economy, and now again seeing kind of trying to establish means of production in local places, and all the fiscal stuff that's going on around that also is part of the inflation story. So I'd like to just get kind of your perspective on how much trade is contributing to this and the barriers that are being erected.
I mean, I think you got it exactly right. It's a bit of an S shape, I suppose. That for a long time now, we've really made the job of central bankers easier, because especially with the spectacular growth in emerging markets, prices have come down. That kept inflation under control, despite loose monetary policy, despite loose fiscal policy. Now we've had the supply chain issues at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, also now in the war in Ukraine, and of course, that then contributes. So that's kind of the upward slope of the S, where it contributes to inflation. But if you look forward, I mean, there's really many more opportunities. People always, or at least sometimes, think that we've reached the end of history, if you will, in terms of trade liberalization. But there's so many more areas where progress can be made, like services is an example, where I see also huge opportunities for not just real income gains, but also inflationary, contributions to keeping inflation low.
And do you worry at all that perhaps that in a sort of inverse sort of logic that this higher inflation will actually compel governments, or may want them to kind of be more protectionist, in the sense that it may give them more control, or give them the sense that they have more control over the prices within their country?
I'm not so sure about the inflation as such, but it could be. I mean, more broadly, of course, the various crises that we've had over the past years have generated this perception that globalization exposes us to excessive risks. And certainly when it comes to inflation, I mean, clearly sourcing only from home would not be a good idea. Not in terms of, I mean, not only not in terms of the level of prices, but also the price volatility. I mean, we review studies here also in this report that make quite clear that more open economies tend to be less volatile. Another thing that central bankers appreciate.
Right, and another thing that the world is watching closely, we certainly are watching very closely at Bloomberg, is the sort of economic slowdown in China. And some of the executives I spoke to sort of recently were talking about kind of maybe this is a new phase for China, where it's more steady, sort of, and less of that miraculous growth. Where do you see China kind of going forward in the conversation around trade?
Well, so we don't have any kind of new predictions on this in this report, but I can use this to advertise another event in October, where we actually present our next trade forecast. So there we're going to have new numbers also on that. But in general, I mean, you're right, of course, that at least in our last trade forecast, we were also predicting, or had in mind at least, that China would grow faster and would be a stronger pull also on world trade. But it's not the only weak region. We also have Europe, think of Germany. There's kind of a mixed picture at the moment in the world economy.
And in terms of, I'm talking more broadly about manufacturing and how manufacturing is changing itself and becoming less labor intensive. How does that play, do you think, into the sort of wealth creation aspect of trade, in the sense that if you have fewer people, that manufacturing may not actually have the same impact on economies that it did, say, 20, 30, 50 years ago? How do you see that sort of going forward? I mean, I was just at a German factory the other day where they're 3D printing everything. There are very few people. The machines are going 24/7. So I'm just curious about your perspective.
I mean, I think it's a great question, and in some sense it's like an age-old question, right? Not age-old perhaps, but at least it's been with us since the Industrial Revolution, where people and workers in particular are understandably concerned about productivity increases and automation in their respective areas of work. I mean, we are more concerned about ChatGPT. Maybe ChatGPT can write this report. Can write this report in the future. But overall, I mean, this is a great opportunity if you have productivity increases, and it's just a question of leveraging this opportunity and making sure that it doesn't create huge inequality. So I'm not so worried about the wealth creation aspect. I'm more concerned about the distributional aspect, and this is something where domestic policies are key.
And stepping out of the sort of deglobalization and any kind of policy efforts to do that sort of thing. In part of the report, you talk about the trade to GDP ratio, which has stayed sort of semi-stagnant since the financial crisis, but really since almost the early 2000s, if I look at the chart. And so I'm curious about kind of what forces are at play structurally outside of that that are diminishing the volumes of trade, and does that also pose the same kinds of risks that less trade does from a politically motivated origin?
No, it's a great question, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to clarify this, because I do think this globalization, as you may call it, so we also look at this in the report, and it's quite clearly not policy-driven, but driven by more mundane factors. Let me just mention two. The first one actually relates quite closely to what we just talked about. Services, the world economy is just moving more and more towards services. And even though services trade is important, services are still not quite as traded as manufacturing. So that structural change is naturally going to lead to a slowdown in the trade to GDP ratio. But perhaps even more importantly, what we saw in the decades preceding that was a massive unbundling of global value chains with, China joining the world economy at the current to the current extent, with Eastern Europe joining the world economy and so on. And at some point, this unbundling of global value chains is also coming to an end. So in some sense, if the natural evolution of the trade to GDP ratio is horizontal, and you need some sort of efforts towards trade globalization if you want it to go up.
And I think that takes us to the next topic, which is what are policymakers not paying enough attention to in that? We talk about digital trade flows, we talk about services. Again, we think, or I think probably a lot of people think about trade as cars and things, but that's increasingly changing. How do policymakers need to think about that?
No, I think it's a great point, and maybe we didn't do ourselves a service by putting a cargo ship here on the front of the report, because you're exactly right that and we keep saying it, that the future of trade, I mean, trade in goods is going to remain important, but the future of trade is in services, and particularly in digitally delivered services. So if I'm thinking about new development opportunities, that's what I would focus on. Perhaps the next China is not going to be a goods trade-led industrialization, but more a service trade-led growth. So I think this is an important area to keep in mind. Also, by the way, when we think about inclusiveness, a lot of the inclusiveness discussion today is still about goods trade and what it does to workers and so on, and that's important. But in some sense, that's a bit of a backward-looking discussion. If I take a forward-looking perspective, if you want to, we need to ask ourselves, are we equipped to, our policymakers, I think, need to ask themselves, are their countries equipped to benefit from this opportunity that digital trade poses, and that
Do we have good models for that? Do we have good examples of places that have done that? Or is this still kind of unknown territory? I
mean, good models. I'm not sure I would. At least in the report, we don't rank countries or anything. We don't have a services performance index or something. But clearly there are countries that stand out in terms of development of the services sector and also digitally delivered services. I mean, India comes to mind, for example, as a country that is pretty active in that space.
Do you think we will be trading fewer goods, sort of in terms of volume, as time goes on?
That's hard to predict, right? Because you have kind of counteracting forces, on the one hand.
I just think of the sort of automated factories and all that sort of stuff,
Could be.
Because it brings me to the next question about agriculture, which is something where one can imagine there will always be things moving, right? And so, but you highlight that it's much more expensive to sort of trade agriculture. I'd like to get into that a little bit, and sort of how do you fix that, and why is that?
I mean, so first of all, on your kind of previous remark, I mean, I do think we're going to continue keep trading goods, and also as we get richer, there's also always more demand for goods. So I don't foresee goods trade ending anytime soon. And in particular, as you said, in agriculture, there are important opportunities. We estimate that the trade costs in agriculture are 48%, if I'm not mistaken, no, 46% higher than in manufacturing, and that points to substantial trade barriers, which are in part policy-driven. I mean, particularly in agriculture, we know tariffs are still high, lots of regulations in place and so on, and that is clearly an opportunity for further integration.
I want to talk a little bit about the environment and
Yes.
carbon, but before getting into sort of the virtues, some of the risks of, we have the United States, we have the Inflation Reduction Act. We now have, Europe wanting to perhaps come up with something a bit bigger and more cohesive. China's been, a backer of its industrial policy for a very long time. And you warned about this, that this could create, real problems internationally in terms of trade, but also for the WTO. How do you see that going now?
Well,
and the sort of the moment of big state again.
Yeah. I think there's a few things that I can say. I mean, first of all, it's the starting point, at least, it's a good thing that governments are, taking climate action and that they make this a policy and priority. That hasn't always been the case, but of course we need to make sure that these actions are taken in a way that, obviously are compatible with our rules, but also embrace trade as part of the solution. And that's where sometimes I think, perhaps the mindset is not quite where I would hope it to be, which is really to understand that, let me put it like this. I'm convinced that we can only achieve a decarbonization of the economy if we do that at reasonable economic costs. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen. And I think if we don't embrace international trade, if we don't embrace the opportunities that come with leveraging environmental comparative advantage, for example, I just don't think we'll be able to deliver a decarbonization of the world economy at acceptable costs, and therefore perhaps not be able to deliver it at all. So I would hope for a more trade-embracing attitude. And of course, it's also the case that, ideally, of course, a more cooperative approach more broadly to this issue would be desirable.
And so this is one of the sort of focuses of the report, which is, carbon, and how can the re-globalization effort sort of help with carbon? And you're saying leveraging some of these sort of advantages that you have internationally to kind of, again, disperse different perhaps kinds of activities to lower carbon markets. How does that look?
Exactly. So the simplest way to understand it is in terms of this green sourcing that I was alluding to before, that yes, recognizing that trade generates transport emissions, but it also, the production of traded goods is also involving production emissions, and they are much more important than the transport emissions. So trade can be part of the solution if you start sourcing goods from greener origins. Now the question is, how does this happen, and how does this kind of aggregate up? And this is where some of this research here comes into play, where one study finds that if there was a worldwide carbon tax, and it's not a study that's trying to promote a worldwide carbon tax, it's just an example of a coordinated climate policy. What you see is that then price incentives are going to be set such that countries increasingly specialize in the goods in which their emissions intensities are relatively low, and as they do that, overall emissions in the world fall. So what the study shows that we quote here is that a carbon tax, and it actually doesn't even depend on the level of the carbon tax that much, it would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, of course, and a third of the effect would be due to countries specializing in what they're relatively green at, which we just wouldn't get without international trade. So that, to me, is really showing that trade is an important force multiplier in that respect.
And in another section, we talk at length about equality and how
Yes.
kind of wealth creation and that sort of thing. If the goal is to sort of to create less inequality and to try to disperse the wealth a little bit more, what are the most powerful sort of trade levers that you can pull to try to achieve that end?
Well, I think the success story in the past has been export-led industrialization. Yeah. We've seen it happen all over the world. There's a question whether that's still possible. I mean, we do see some of it. We also document this in the report, that we see some of the global value chain activity now move to other countries like Vietnam, for example, or Cambodia or Romania. I think are some examples that come out in the report. But there's a question of whether that's also the model of the future. That if I just look at the trends, I really think we need to think about services trade, and as we discussed before, trade in digitally delivered services. So that's a horse one could bet on, to try to really achieve a growth like that. And some economies do it. I mentioned India before, but we also have an interesting case study on Bangladesh in the report, showing how they are trying to leverage this potential.
I think I've probably almost taken all of my time, but maybe I'll ask one more question. We can open up the question to the audience if there are any. I have another sort of, this is more of away from the report and more sort of as your unique perspective. Goods going to Russia. Obviously, there's been a huge amount of efforts to prevent that from happening from Western countries. We've seen trade flows increase in a lot of neighboring countries. Do you have any sort of idea around kind of how much trade is sort of escaping the sanctions and the measures that have been put in place?
So we haven't analyzed that. I mean, of course, that's something that you read about in the media. But perhaps I can use it as an opportunity to clarify something I said before. So before I was talking about the fact that trade growth within these hypothetical blocks, or between rather these hypothetical blocks, is 4 to 6% slower than trade growth within these blocks since the onset of the war in Ukraine. And from that figure, we explicitly exclude Russia and Ukraine because we didn't want it to just capture the effect of sanctions. But that wasn't the question you you answered. I don't have a good answer to use.
So I'll put I'll put it up to the audience. If anyone has a question, they can raise their hands. I think that you just have to press the button and we'll be able to hear you. To the gentleman there, right? We've got, and put my earpiece on as well.
My name is Pritam Banerjee. I'm from the Center for WTO Studies in India. I have a quick question on the the estimation that you were discussing. When we are looking at the range of products where countries are trying to either near source or friend source, they tend to be stuck around a few specific products. These are either technology sensitive products or critical raw materials or critical intermediates. And a vast amount of products, actually no country would even think of nearshoring or friendshoring because they are part of general trade. So did you make that distinction or did you just take all of trade?
It's a great question, and I agree completely with what you say, that of course the policy-driven the policy-driven push towards economic independence, let's say, is of course particularly focused on these products that you mentioned, high-tech products, products related to the sustainable, to sustainable development in the climate sense. So I agree with that in terms of our analysis. So we actually look at, when we say that, first signs of fragmentation are emerging, we actually look at all trade. So in some sense, it's even more surprising. Just when we have a short section also on China-US trade, and there we make that distinction, and we find exactly what you have in mind.
Thank you for that. Do we have any other questions?
Thank you so much. Great presentation. I'm Deborah James from the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. Every time I come here, I do always hear about trade being part of the solution, and you acknowledge that trade flows increase emissions from shipping, but it really depends also on under which rules the trade is conducted, obviously. When we think about intellectual property rules, they actually limit the transfer of climate technologies that we need all countries to use in order to seriously address climate change. And in some of the examples you used, I was also noting how trade rules contribute to deindustrialization. So many countries actually couldn't produce their own PPE fast enough or masks on short notice and had to purchase them. So a lot of trade in that doesn't actually mean a good thing in terms of the rules of trade. You talked about trade in medical devices, but it's the intellectual property rules of this House, the WTO, that restricted the ability of countries to produce their own vaccines and led to the unnecessary premature death of over 1 million people. And the WTO absolutely failed to remedy that, even though over 100 members advocated for it for years. And instead we saw a few big pharma CEOs become billionaires because of WTO rules. Another example, here in WTO, there's discussions about the circular economy. And at the UN, there are negotiations on plastics which are intended to reduce plastic production, but here the plastics negotiations are actually aimed to increase trade in plastics. The WTO seems to be then a sort of a one-trick pony. There's like the one solution is always to increase trade without looking at things in a balanced way. But sometimes having more local production, say local alternatives to plastics, would be a better solution. And if you look at something like a big, thing being discussed now here, like CBAMs, UNCTAD has noted the very limited efficacy of CBAMs in mitigating climate change with a 0.1% drop in global CO2 emissions, but much higher trade costs, up to $6 billion for developing countries because of CBAMs. There's many other ways to reduce emissions more effectively than imposing costs on developing countries. So the point is that it's not just about do we trade or do we not trade, but it's about the specific rules under which trade happens. And unfortunately, we find time and time again that the WTO rules actually favor the multinational corporations and rich country governments because they're the ones who wrote them. And if we look at many of the proposals under sustainability here at the WTO, they benefit the same parties, and they don't include the basic UN legal architecture of common but differentiated responsibility, which is in every multilateral environmental agreement. So my question is, when I balance my checkbook, my bank account, I'm not allowed to only count income. I have to actually also put the expenses on the ledger. And as an economist, one is supposed to be able to talk about both sides, the damage that trade does as well as the potential contributions. Otherwise, it's sort of more of like a media flack, like an advertising job. And so if it's to be an economic analysis, my question is, what were the areas when you looked at how WTO policies now actually can address climate change? What did you find of existing WTO policies like IP restrictions that represent the biggest transfer of wealth from the global south to the global north in the history of the world? What did you find about WTO rules now that need to change in order to address climate change, or did you guys just not look at that because you only want to focus on WTO as a solution? Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much for this question or statement. So of course, no, but it's welcome because I do think we wanna engage with that because I certainly don't want to be perceived as just a marketing like a PR person of the WTO that just keeps saying that trade is part of the solution to everything, because I don't think it is. And well, it's not everything is good with trade, not everything is good with the WTO, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, and we do that also in the report. So let me just pick one example. So we talked about the production emissions and the transport emissions that are related to international trade, and how trade can be part of the solution if we source from relatively green origins. Of course, the flip side of it is trade can also be part of the problem if you start sourcing from relatively brown origins. So there's nothing inherent in trade that's good or bad for the environment in that particular example. We have other examples, but let me just take this one because that's one I'm most familiar with. So the point that we are making here is that really what you need is you need to embrace trade, but you need to complement it with coordinated climate policies if you want to leverage this potential. So I'm not trying to argue that it's always a good thing and not a bad thing. And in this report, it's not that we've kind of looked back in time and asked ourselves, what's been good about the WTO and what's been bad about the WTO. When have we been part of the problem and when have we been part of the solution? But we've been more forward-looking and thinking about how we can be part of the solution in the future. And on your particular question on intellectual property, I don't think there's so this is not a so when we talk about at least in the sustainability chapter, it's not one of the main focuses, but I take your point that this is something to look into.
And as I think the time is now running somewhat against us, maybe one quick question from the gentleman there.
Yeah, kia ora, thank you. My name's Maui Solomon, and I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand, an Indigenous representative representing ngā toki whakarururanga. So this is really a follow-up question to the previous person who asked a question, and your response was that you consider trade as one of the solutions to help with the climate crisis that we're currently facing through trading with more green-based products and countries that produce them. So my question is this, given that Indigenous peoples around the world have preserved 80% of the world's biological diversity, do you consider that Indigenous peoples' worldviews on how to preserve the planet is one of those options that should be looked at in terms of combating the climate crisis we currently face? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the question, and also thank you very much for coming all the way to Geneva. Of course, I and we, I think, would be interested in hearing about any possible solution to this problem we face, and in particular, any possible way in which trade can help, or if it doesn't help in a particular instance, how we can kind of mitigate that. So I would be very interested in kind of a further dialogue exchange on this issue.
And I think as we talk about all the risks that abound, whether they be the sort of disintegration of the global sort of economic structure that could lead to greater political and military uncertainty, I'd like to end, if we might, on a note of optimism.
Okay.
In terms of, so what gives you sort of optimism about how we can move forward and sort of look at this slightly differently to try to avoid some of the pitfalls and sort of the issues that we've had the unraveling of recently?
I mean, maybe I can go back to the basics there and tell you why I think international trade is so important, and why I also think that at the end of the day, most people will agree with that. If you just forget about globalization and trade, and there are all these like big terms that are kind of abstract, but if we think about our own individual lives, I think all of us would agree that the division of labor is a key foundation of our prosperity. If I had to, make my own clothes and
or an iPhone.
Well, forget about the iPhone even, but if you had to make your own clothes, grow your own food, build your own house, and so on, I think if we lived in personal autarky individually, I think we would all realize that this is not a good idea. Now, if you have a division of labor, forget about international, just you and me, we do need exchange. And that's trade, and that's the foundation of trade. And there's really no reason why this fundamental principle that the division of labor brings prosperity should end at international borders. So at a very basic level, I think most people understand this idea, and I hope that this will also carry us forward. What I think where we need to where a little bit more kind of convincing needs to be done is that beyond these economic gains from trade, there are also possibly other gains to be had in terms of sustainability, inclusiveness, and security. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussions following this presentation.
Well, Ralph, thank you so much for your time, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you very much, Oliver.